Okay. Okay. So today I want to talk about a concept that's been kind of bugging me for a while. So let me go ahead and start by saying that most people tend to agree with this concept called the right to property. It's better when I look at the camera. I think it's better when I look at the camera. Let me start over. Oh. Okay, so let me start over and let me start over. So basically, there's this concept that a lot of people seem to agree with in the West, and it's the idea of the right to property. So when I say right to property, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that in general, we believe that we can own things. It's like an important part is that you actually can own things, and then the things that you own, you have some level of authority over. Okay, if you mention the concept of like the right to property, most people aren't going to question this, regardless of their philosophical system, and regardless of their like political alignment. They're generally going to agree, yes, that like you have a right to property in some way. However, if you have a right to property, which we all generally agree that we do, then it feels important to talk about the legitimate ways that you can acquire property. So, because it seems like intuitively, if you can own property, then there are legitimate and illegitimate ways of actually getting that property. So generally speaking, I have a document for this, but it's still kind of ongoing. Generally speaking, there are three broad methods that people use to acquire property. The first method is something I would call acquisition of unclaimed items. So what that means is that you find an item that is unclaimed, no one's ever claimed it before, and you claim it. The second one is acquisition of items from another entity, willing. So what this means is that there's some other entity, maybe it's a person, maybe it's like the government, but they own a thing and they say, here you go, you can have this thing. And then I would include in that both like gifts and then also like when you're trading items. So if I buy a hamburger from McDonald's and I give them money in exchange for that hamburger, I have acquired that hamburger, and I've done it through the willing consent of the McDonald's Corporation. And they have acquired my money, and they have acquired that money through the willing consent of me. And then the third type is acquisitions of items from another entity, non-willing. So this would be when you get something from somebody else, but they did not consent to that interaction. So essentially, if you steal from somebody else, that would be covered here. If you like conquer or like pillage or rape, like any of these things, depending on where exactly you draw the lines of like items and property, all of these things could be considered acquisition of items non-willing, or enslaving someone would be essentially acquiring property in a non-willing manner, at least most of the time. So we've got these three broad ways that you can acquire property. Claiming things that are unclaimed, or you can claim something from another person, either willing or non-willing. So then the question is, which, if any, of these methods of acquiring things are legitimate ways of acquiring things? And not just legitimate in the sense that like you can literally do it, because obviously you can do all of them, but which ones of them, if any, are moral? So intuitively, it is always immoral to acquire an item from an entity that is non-willing. So it seems like intrinsically it is not okay ever to take an item from somebody without their consent. Or at the very least, it is not okay to do it except in the most extreme circumstances. So for example, if they've in turn stolen something else, or like if you need that item for the sake of a crime or something, I don't know, or like not to do a crime, obviously to look into a crime, to investigate a crime, then in those situations, you might kind of need to take those things, even if the person isn't willing to give you them. But in general, it seems like it's bad to take something from another person if they're not willing to give it to you. Also, it seems intuitively like it is okay to take something from another entity if they are willing to give it to you, assuming that their ownership of that thing is legitimate. So if I own something, we can say, for example, going back to the McDonald's analogy, we can talk about my money, right? If I give my money to McDonald's, we normally assume that the money that I got for that transaction, I got it legitimately. And we normally assume that the hamburger that McDonald's is trying to sell to me, they got legitimately. So both of us, so I got my money legitimately, McDonald's got their hamburger legitimately, and if we trade those items, we were both willing and we both got them legitimately, so there's no problem there. There's nothing immoral about trading items or about giving gifts, as long as we say that the original obtainment of that item was willing. So importantly, and this is going to be really, really important later, but importantly, if we say that I got an item through illegitimate means. So for example, let's say that I stole that money. Then using that money or giving that money away or trading that money would also be illegitimate. But assuming you got the thing and you got it legitimately, there's no problem with you choosing to give it to someone else, either just as a gift or giving it to them as like a trade of goods. So that brings us back to the first point, the acquisition of unclaimed items. So the question here is it moral to claim things which are unclaimed? So there's two big examples that we can talk about here. And I can talk about like why I have kind of a problem with this one. Not like I agree with it or disagree with it, but literally I don't know what the answer is. So let's say hypothetically that you're walking through a forest, like a public forest, so nobody owns it. And then you see like a rock, and the rock looks really cool. So you decide, okay, I'm going to take the rock with me. The rock is now my personal property. Most of us at some point in our lives have probably done something pretty similar to this. A really easy one to think about is like, finding pennies on the ground. Nobody thinks it's immoral to take a penny from the ground. And probably we've all seen like at some point or another, there's been like something on the ground, especially as children. You see something on the ground, it looks really cool, you decide to keep it. Most of us don't have a problem with this. However, there's one really, really big area where this gets challenged. And essentially it has to do with one person claiming too much stuff. So, example, hypothetical. And for the record, I stole this example from a debate between a YouTuber called Vaush and a libertarian. So imagine that you crash land on an island with one other person. Imagine that the other person wakes up way ahead of you. So before you wake up, this person, before you wake up, this person decides to claim everything on the island. Okay. Well, technically, we don't have a problem yet because it seems intuitively, based on the first example, like he can claim things that aren't claimed. So then you wake up and you are informed that everything on the island has been claimed. You are not allowed to set foot onto the island. You are only allowed to stay in the airplane, and you are not allowed to have access to any of the resources on the island without the consent of the person who woke up first. So the problem here is that it seems like in this example, the other person shouldn't be able to make that claim of ownership. Or at the very least, if they make that claim, you are under no obligation to honor it, essentially. You like that if you were to go and consume items on the island for your survival, that their claim is so illegitimate that you would be 100% in the right to go do that. And if they were to enact force on you to defend their property claim, you would be the one who would have the better claim of self-defense there if you decided to, counterattack them. But therein lies the dilemma, because all they've done is claim things that were previously unclaimed. So if all they're doing is claiming things that are unclaimed, it seems like, on the one hand, based on our earlier analogy, that you should be able to, they should be able to do that they should be able to say, I own these things now. But again, the problem being that if you were to honor that, you would die. And it seems like one of my criteria for evaluating a moral claim is the reasonability of which it could be expected to be followed. So if I can prove something is moral, but no one would follow it, it's almost irrelevant that I could prove that. So I call this the problem with what I would call like first ownership. How do we decide, given an unowned state of the world or a state of the world before private ownership, how do we justify who gets to own what? And then the problem persists into the modern day. So for example, Jeff Bezos owns a lot of stuff. Does Jeff Bezos own that stuff legitimately? Well, kind of, because his claims of ownership are based on previous claims of ownership. And those claims of ownership are based on even more previous claims of ownership. But eventually, what ends up happening is, if we regress far enough back, the reason why Jeff Bezos owns the things he does is because somebody made a claim of first ownership over something. And the problem is, if we assume that claim of first ownership is illegitimate, then it becomes impossible to say that Jeff Bezos owns his property legitimately. It's like building like a tower, right? If that foundational ownership of that first ownership of things when they were unclaimed is illegitimate, and his claim is ultimately based upon that claim, then his claims of ownership are also illegitimate. So then at that point, who can really say who should own anything? Like at that point, because all claims of ownership are based on previous claims of ownership, which are in turn based on claims of unowned things. And if we can't justify the claims of unowned things, then it doesn't seem like we can justify any claims of ownership in the modern day. Now, in the modern day, it kind of seems like the way that we kind of treat the way that we kind of justify this is we kind of just don't. We just kind of assume that modern claims of ownership are legitimate by definition. But they're not, or rather, it seems hard to justify that. And so then at that point, if somebody says to you that they are stealing your property for legitimate reasons, can you really argue with them stealing your property for legitimate reasons if your original claims of ownership aren't based on anything substantial anyway? I don't actually know what the solution to this is. If you could ever justify first ownership in any meaningful way. It seems like, at best, the only way that you could possibly justify first ownership in a legitimate way would be through the consent of some greater organized body. So in other words, it seems like in order to justify first ownership at all, you have to have what is essentially a government. And that if you don't have a government to dictate the terms of ownership, that you can't really have legitimate claims of ownership. Because ownership on a one-by-one basis, well, if you claim first ownership of something, but I also claim first ownership of it, and again, to clarify, when I say first ownership, I mean like this thing is unclaimed right now. It is just a natural part of the world, and we're both trying to claim it, like a tree. We both see a tree in the wilderness, and we both think it's cool. Who gets to claim the tree? So it seems like the only way that you can possibly justify that is with a government, to basically say, like, okay, well, based on these criteria, this person owns this tree. Okay, so that's sort of like the big idea there. Stream.